Hello, everyone. Welcome back to Plotlines. I'm your host, Connor, and today we're going to be talking about a book that came out relatively recently, The Pope's Exorcist, 101 Questions About Father Gabriel Amorth, published by Sophia Institute Press. And to help go through it with us is Jordan Burke. He is the spokesman for this book that came out from Sophia Institute Press. Jordan, welcome to the program.
Thanks for having me.
Can you give the audience just a little bit about yourself so we can familiarize?
Yeah. So I was not born, I wasn't raised Catholic. I was kind of all over the place with my dad. My dad converted, and then I kind of did the research and converted in high school. And unfortunately, as I think is the case with most people, I never really made the faith my own. And so that resulted in a non-virtuous life, to put it kindly. And I ended up falling away from the church for a time. So I was a cop for a number of years, and that put a strain on my faith life and things of that nature. Completely fell away. And by the grace of God, I had a pretty, I would say, miraculous conversion, or reversion, I think would be more proper to say, and was lit on fire and came back with a vengeance, and got hired by the Avila Foundation, which is spiritualdirection.com, My High Calling. If anyone out there thinks they want to be a priest, myhighcalling.com will help you out. Avila Institute, all those different things, and started an apostolate on my own to help kind of combat a lot of the stuff that I fell into, mainly pornography. And that's called Do the Harder Thing. And the way, God, I kind of joke about this a lot, but the way that God works, he says, okay, you did what I wanted you to do here, and now I want you to do something else. And so that led me into the world of spiritual warfare. And so I've been researching, studying, talking to and working with, to an extent, I'm using with air quotes because I don't want false credibility here, but with exorcists on certain things, learning from them and trying to distill that information in such a way that all of us here can utilize that knowledge to both live a more virtuous life and to fulfill the mission that God's put before us to bring about his kingdom, which includes crushing the head of the serpent. So
that's beautiful. Awesome. Good to know that. Well, it's great having you on. For everyone watching, please like, share, comment, and subscribe so we can beat the algorithm. So it seems to me that this book is out to combat the movie The Pope's Exorcist with Russell Crowe. And I think that's very important. On this channel and on this podcast, we often discuss stories, fiction, as well as spiritual sides. And so this is kind of coming together in an interesting way, setting the record straight about Father Gabriel Amorth. Do you think that's a good summary of sort of the purpose of this book?
Yeah, I think that's totally fair. You and I were talking before this, and Sophia Press has not said for sure that was their purpose, but knowing all the good folks over there, it's a safe bet that may have been part of the reason why they did this. Because as I mentioned before we went live, I'll say I haven't seen the movie myself. I don't plan on seeing it. But I've read some reviews, and from what I've read, there's some pretty egregious lies about Father Amorth and what he did and how he acted that are egregious is actually probably not strong enough of a word if what I read is correct. So having a book like this and knowing who he was and what he did and what he believed and what he practiced and how he did those things is really important, because Hollywood is just going to take any liberty that they can to sell a movie.
Exactly. And I haven't seen it because I am not a horror film guy.
Same. Totally the same.
That's not the purpose I go to see a movie for. Yep. And I really don't want to experience that.
Yeah.
Yep. So I'd love to know why you think Father Gabriel Amorth is important.
Oh, that's a great question. So Father Amorth is a rare case in which we have one man who, by the grace of God, was given an extraordinary amount of experience and information in an area in the church that isn't really taught about all that often, and is constant. And there's such an influx of information into how things kind of change throughout history. So I'll say this, he became a priest at 32 years old, but he didn't become an exorcist until he was in his 60s, and he died at 91. So he stopped performing exorcisms a little bit prior to his death, or he slowed down at least. I don't know the exact time there. There's none of his books are very clear on when he kind of slowed down. But just thinking about how one priest in his 60s, from 60 to 91, in that short period of time, performed over 60,000 exorcisms, which is wild. So
Wow.
you can imagine the kind of information that he was able to gather and learn throughout that process. And in his importance in the church, I mean, he founded the International Association for Exorcists. Before that time, there seemed to be no real way for exorcists to kind of exchange information unless they knew one another. Formal training of sorts. We have Pope Leo the 13th Institute now, as well as the IAE. But his knowledge and the things that he learned and experienced are so important to us trying to learn and navigate the world of spiritual warfare, which is normative. If you're living the Catholic life and the faith, even Christian life, if you're listening to this and you're not Catholic, you're still going to experience the enemy. So if you want to learn how to navigate it, this guy he has the experience.
Yeah, and this book is a great way to get a peek into what this man knew about the demonic. Now, would you say that is it proper to say that every exorcism is successful?
No. So
Yeah.
interestingly enough, he had a case that he was not able to free the person from the demonic possession in his time. So he passes, and then the case got passed on to his kind of apprentice. And then his apprentice, as far as I know, still wasn't able to release the person from the exorcism. And I hesitate to say it's not uncommon, because I don't think that's a fair statement, and I don't want people to be afraid and think like, oh no, I'm never going to be free. That's not the case at all. This even gets into a whole conversation of God's permissive will and things of that nature. But to answer your question in short, no, not every exorcism is successful, and for whatever reason that may be, ideally, I mean, everything is according to God's will. But no, there's some that are not freed.
How would you define what an exorcism is?
That's a phenomenal question. So there's the solemn rite of exorcism. There's minor exorcisms and major exorcism. The major exorcism is a solemn rite of exorcism. Minor exorcisms have kind of a looser definition, but in the case of what we're talking about with Father Amorth performing the solemn rite of exorcism, it is essentially a session in which the priest, the exorcist priest, has been appointed by the bishop to pray a particular set of prayers that only are appropriate for an exorcist priest to pray for this person to help free them from a demonic possession. There's varying levels of possession as well, but in this case, with what he did, and he did a lot of things, but to your question, the solemn rite of exorcism is someone who is fully possessed, we'll just say fully possessed, and he's praying particular prayers to help free that person.
So would the larger definition of exorcism be something like doing battle with the demonic?
Yeah, that's fair. I think, but in a particular way, because as I mentioned earlier, if you're living the normative Catholic life, you're going to be battling the demonic on, I wouldn't say a daily basis. I don't think that's an exaggeration, but you're going to be battling, maybe it's more appropriate to say, the influence of the enemy. So people out there, and maybe you're familiar with the Ignatian discernment of spirits, right? The rules that he wrote to help people navigate their daily lives and learn, okay, not every thought in my head is my own and I shouldn't listen. Maybe this moment where I am tempted towards anger is just that, and a temptation. And how do I go about combating that? And that would be, battling the enemy. In the case of exorcisms, it's a whole different level where you're dealing with people who may be manifesting, the demon may speak through them. There's all sorts of different things going on. It's that battle, but it's on a much larger scale, maybe a deeper level. Maybe that's a good way to kind of describe it.
Gotcha. So it's great. It's great to know sort of the basics of exorcisms and what it
Sure.
is. But why should we be afraid of demonic possession?
So I take an interesting stance on this, and I feel like most of the exorcists that we've worked with would agree for the most part. And I don't think we should be afraid of possession. I think the way that I describe demons to people is like they're mosquitoes. They're there and they're going to try to bug you. They're going to try to get you, and you should be aware. And when they bite you, you should smack at them. And you should be a little bit concerned because some of them, can cause some harm. Like a mosquito can transmit a disease. With demons, people can become possessed. That being said, if you're, again, I keep using this phrase, the normative Christian or Catholic life, if you are living a life of virtue, if you are pursuing the sacraments as often as possible, the Eucharist, reconciliation, if you have a good prayer life, if you're choosing the good as much as you can, you are going to have far more protection than you could even imagine. Like that's the primary way that you protect yourself. It's not like you can just, unless God permits it, you're not just going to snap and get possessed. You know what I mean? That's very, very rare. But so fear. I don't like giving more power to the enemy than he's due, because as we know, Mary crushes the head of Satan, and God's provided everything within our faith to combat it, in all these various different ways.
I guess maybe a better way of sort of rephrasing would be why should we avoid demonic possession?
Okay, so let's take this a step deeper, right? So of course you don't want to be possessed because it's horrific. So a demon cannot possess your soul, but a demon can possess your body partly or fully, right? So it's interesting, you read some of the cases from some of these exorcists where a demon will possess a particular part of someone's body, this sounds kind of crazy, but like someone's back, for whatever reason, the demon is only permitted to exist there. In full possessions, you have some different scenarios. But the act of when someone is possessed, it's horrific. They're suffering. It's intense suffering. Both of my parents were they assisted in multiple exorcisms, and some of the things that they've shared where they could, where appropriate, it's horrific, and not horror movie horrific, although that does occur, but just intense sadness. This person is suffering. So then the question is, well, why would you? Obviously, you want to avoid that, but how do you avoid that? Avoid mortal sin. That's a huge doorway. Unforgiveness is a doorway. The obvious ones, the occult, dabbling in the occult and dabbling in things that are not permissible to the because the church says they're not permissible, but also because it's pretty obvious that you shouldn't go to a palm reader. It's pretty obvious that, or it should be obvious that you shouldn't be dealing with astrology, divination, Enneagram, like all these different things that are of occult origin that should be avoided, that open up doorways for demonic possession. I don't know if that answered your question.
I think it does, yeah.
Okay.
So there's so much fascination in Hollywood for exorcisms. Like there's so many movies regarding exorcisms. I mean, obviously Russell Crowe is a big actor who probably chose this opportunity to play someone like Father Gabriel Amorth in a movie. Why do you think there's such a fascination amongst people in Hollywood with something most of them probably don't believe in?
Yeah, that's a fascinating question. I've wondered that a lot myself. I think part of it is it's kind of like the analogy of a train wreck. People just can't pull their eyes away, even though it's horrific, and they don't want to watch, but they do watch anyway. I think the other issue is that, I mean, I don't want to put on a tinfoil hat, but if you just look at the news and you see how a lot of some of these actors, these producers, that world is ripe with demonic activity. It just is. Whether or not they believe it doesn't necessarily matter in this context, because they're involved in it in a lot of different ways. And of course, not everybody, that you can't make a blanket statement, but a lot of them. And I think that there's also maybe a third aspect of this disordered curiosity, this curiositas, where people are just fascinated with things that are ugly and fascinated with things that are horrific. And I don't know what that is. Maybe it's concupiscence. Maybe it's part of our fallen human nature where we're just drawn to these things. But I don't know if that is an adequate answer to the problem, to explain the problem. But yeah, that's a great question. I wish I had a more accurate answer.
I mean, we're not you and I are not planning on going to see the movie
Right.
anytime soon or anything like that. But would there be a situation where you would go to a movie about an exorcist if it wasn't a horror movie, if it was supposed to be more realistic, or should people just avoid that type of thing?
Well, so here's my take, and this is strictly my take. Knowing how the enemy operates in our lives, one of the primary ways that they can influence us and mess with us, quite frankly, is through our imagination. And so I'm very careful with what I put into my mind, because I know that the enemy can use that later on. You hear about this a lot with guys who struggle with pornography for a long time, where those images will pop back up for them. Even, let's just say, by the grace of God, they've kicked that habit. It will still pop up and they'll still be tempted with those images. And it's just the enemy trying to get them to slip. The enemy is trying that doorknob. Like, okay, you close the door, but is it locked? Like he's trying it.
Yeah.
So I'm very particular with what I listen to: music, podcasts, movies. Now, I will say that I'm in a weird position where I have to kind of speak on these things and people want my opinions on it. I don't think this movie is worth seeing after reading the reviews and knowing the different liberties that they took that were completely inaccurate. And the fact that, I've seen the trailer and it just seems to glorify evil. And I'm not going to engage in that. Now, comparative to something like Nefarious, which I have not seen, I do plan on seeing that, but only because and we're loosely connected with people who made it, but because it's A, not a horror movie, and B, it's a completely orthodox understanding of the battle that we're in. So people have to really discern. There's a podcast I'm going to put a review out of on soon called the Exorcist Files from Father Carlos Martins, who assisted on the movie Nefarious. And the podcast is phenomenal. That being said, if people are sensitive to those kinds of topics, they may discern that they don't want to listen, because it's very well produced and they do reenactments and, it has kind of that feel to it, but everything in that podcast is orthodox and really, really, really well done. And it's almost like catechesis. So it's tough, people need to discern, but in terms of like the Pope's Exorcist, that just seems like a no-go all around.
Gotcha. Do you think that they're just doing this for money purposes in some ways? Because like, why bring some people's attentions to something like this? Like, it seems like even if it's not orthodox, don't you think there's some good that might come out of just knowing exorcisms exist?
Yeah, potentially. Yeah. I mean, you can't rule that out. I think with my previous statement, I'm speaking more to the folks who already know, what I
Sure.
mean? Folks who already live in the faith. If there's someone out there who doesn't know anything about it and they see it, I mean, God can use anything for good. Like I mentioned, when I started my ministry initially, it was because I had fallen to pornography and it had destroyed much of my life. And God used my own failings and my yes to him and my brokenness to turn that around and help people out. Now, does that mean that people should go watch pornography and be converted? Of course not. You know what I mean? It doesn't work. It doesn't work that way. But God can still use it. So again, it's a personal discernment thing, I think.
Sure. Awesome. Okay. So what are Father Gabriel Omorth's greatest tools in exorcisms? Like what was his what was his tools?
So he carried a little briefcase, and in it he had his purple stole. He had I believe he had a wooden crucifix and a silver crucifix, holy water, and blessed oils. But primarily the number one thing that he had was prayers, right? So he had what's fascinating about Father Amorth is that he had the rite of exorcism, which is a very long rite. He had it memorized, which of course, if you're doing 60,000 exorcisms, you're going to have it memorized.
Yeah.
Still pretty amazing. But with those physical things, those sacramentals, whether it's the crucifix or the holy water, or whatever he had with him, the prayers were such a primary aspect of what he was doing, because it's not the exorcist that casts out demons, it's Jesus through the exorcist. It all goes back to Jesus. So invoking Jesus, invoking God, invoking Mary, invoking the saints, all these things, these prayers are so powerful. And then even exorcists today will use many things like relics are a big part of exorcisms now. And that's, again, it's invoking these saints and God using these sacramentals and these things to help free people who are suffering tremendously.
I think the book says that sometimes a demon would be exorcised even just the presence of a saint, by the presence of a saint.
Yeah. I mean, we can look at scripture, and I believe it was Peter, his shadow, right, would cause healings and would I believe, don't quote me on this, I'm not a I'm not a theologian, but we know his shadow had a powerful effect. And pieces of his garment were taken around and healed people. So yeah, I mean, it's prayer and the things that the church has given us are powerful means to freedom.
Was there any difference between sort of the wooden cross, wooden crucifix, and the silver crucifix?
I don't know. I've read all of his books, and not a single one has mentioned any difference between the two. I'm wondering, and I've been curious about that myself. I wonder if it was just, he really liked one more than the other. I don't know. Maybe, it could have been made of olive wood too. I'm not sure. I think we all kind of have one of those rosaries with olive wood from the Holy Land. So there's no telling.
Well, there can be. I mean, can be some physical danger during exorcisms,
Oh, for sure.
right?
Yeah.
So, would it be that a silver one might be more dangerous in some ways to the exorcist
Maybe.
himself?
Yeah, maybe. I'm not sure. I'm not. That's a really good question. There is danger. So he mentions in the book about how the room where he did the exorcisms primarily had a bed, and the bed had restraints. And so a lot of people hear that and they're like, ooh, that sounds weird. But when you understand what goes on in an exorcism, those restraints are to help keep the person not just from harming others, but primarily from harming themselves. Because when a demon manifests, there's no telling what can happen. I was just listening to a story about a exorcist priest who was grabbed by the person who was possessed and lifted off the ground by his throat. So there is danger involved in some of these cases. That being said, though, there's also times where there was another case where a assistant was, because the exorcists have teams of assistants who are usually praying, it's intercessory prayer, and helping make sure that everything, no one gets hurt, and then also for accountability purposes. But this person discovered that, and when they invoked the archangels, that they didn't have to physically restrain the person anymore. So that they went from fighting with the person, holding their legs and arms down, things of that nature. And this person recounted that when they started invoking the archangels, by the time the exorcism was done, they were only using like a finger to hold the person down, because the archangels were interceding for them and they were doing the bulk of the work. So
That's really interesting.
yeah.
We kind of skipped a little bit regarding how someone would get in the process of going through an exorcism.
Sure. So if there are people who are out there who believe that they're possessed, the process is intricate for a reason, because primarily the church wants to make sure that whether or not you're possessed, whether it's possession or simply a mental illness, that they can help you as much as possible. So let's say that it's not a possession, they determine that's a mental illness. They want to get you help. The church is not just going to say, well, you're not possessed, and then send you out the door. They love the people that, the church loves its congregation and wants to help heal people. But the process involves, in a lot of ways, you would contact your diocese. You would say, look, I'm struggling with this. I think I might be possessed. This is what's going on. And they walk you through the process. And a lot of times it even begins with meeting with a trusted therapist, and the therapist can help determine, as I mentioned, the mental illness portion of it. And that's a complicated topic in and of itself. But you go through that, and if the therapist says, yeah, I think there's something more here, then it can move on to the Exorcist. And I'm giving a very nutshell version here. But yeah, it's not a like, oh, I think I'm having some issues, I'm going to go see an Exorcist. It's like, no, their time has to be protected. And unfortunately, there's a lot of people who fake symptoms of possession in order to, because of whatever they're dealing with mentally, in order to fulfill whatever need they think they need to fulfill from the Exorcist.
Interesting. So, I mean, it all comes down to somebody's desire to be exorcised.
Right.
And I imagine that might fall in the case of like parents if a child becomes possessed.
Yeah. So there's a case I heard recently where a daughter was possessed. She was possessed through basically a wound. Her father had abandoned her, and she ended up having some serious psychological issues, depression, as well as gosh, I can't remember the other thing she was struggling with, but she had some mental issues. And so a demon saw that wound. A wound is a big doorway for people who have wounds and they don't seek to heal them. And the demon presented itself to her as her father who left, and got permission to possess her. It tricked her, essentially, because that's what demons do. And she became possessed. And so she had no clue that she was possessed, but her parents figured it out because of some of the things that were going on. And they took her to an exorcist, and then kind of the process began there. So yeah, it's totally possible for parents to bring people in. It's not uncommon for people from other denominations. There's another case I heard recently that was similar to that, where someone who was not a Catholic was possessed, and they went to their non-Catholic parish, and the person there said, hey, listen, this is above my pay grade. You need to go to the Catholics. And then they kind of went through the process there.
It's so, so crazy that that's a mindset of Protestants to be like, we can't deal with this. Better go to the Catholic Church. Just
Right.
how is there a disconnect between that and like faith? Like,
I wish I knew. Yeah, it's so I've heard multiple stories like that, and I'm like, okay, guys, you're right there. You're right there. Come into the fullness. We got a lot to offer you.
You've already admitted
Yeah.
the weakness of your denomination.
Right.
But I just want to make sure everyone knows. So it's voluntary. There's exorcisms
Right.
are always voluntary.
Right.
Okay.
Right.
Now, I thought it was interesting what the book said about Father Gabriel Amorth's relationship with the Charismatic Renewal. Could you speak to that?
Yeah, this was fascinating for me as well. So Father Amorth was actually huge, a huge proponent of the Charismatic Renewal. He loved them a lot, but he was also this is one of the things I love about Father Amorth. He loved them and he encouraged them, but he also recognized some of the shortcomings that happen within the Charismatic Renewal. And I am not anti-charismatic at all, so I'm speaking strictly to what he wrote. And he was very clear to say, he outright said, if anyone says that they have a gift, a charismatic gift, they don't have it. And he said that in multiple of his books. If they say they have the gift, they don't have it. He said the people who truly have gifts keep it hidden, and they only use it when God, kind of tells them or permits them to use it. And then he was very strong, and he said, listen, I don't like people laying hands on anybody else for multiple reasons. And he said, I've told multiple charismatic conferences that I've spoken at to not do that, and they do their own thing. They just keep doing their own thing. So I wish they would stop. But again, he was still a proponent of them, and he recognized that in a lot of ways the charismatics kind of pick up where certain aspects of the church have kind of fallen off. So, I think it goes back to we're all members of one body, and we're all just kind of carrying different aspects of that.
Sure. And I think, at least from my perspective, that if those things that Father Amorth said, I think there would be a lot more people interested in the Charismatic Renewal,
Right.
that have some concerns with it, with the laying of hands, and sort of this discussion of gifts like that. So Was he sort of the first well-known exorcist, or were there others previously?
So the most well known is Jesus, of course, right?
Priest, I guess I should
Yeah.
say.
So Jesus, and then the disciples, of course.
Yeah.
But outside of him, in modern times, priests, as you said, I think he was kind of a I don't want to say trendsetter, because I don't think that's the appropriate word, but he was willing to speak about these things in a way that it seems as if at the time that no one else really wanted to speak about. So in that sense, yeah, he was probably one of the most well known. And certainly his writing has been prolific over the years, before he passed. And his books are still, I mean, obviously, Sophia just printed another book of his, or regarding his questions. But his books continue to sell, and he's a leading authority. It makes sense. You know, he was Rome's exorcist for his whole career. So, or for most of his career, I should say.
Yeah, I should have specified not God
Right.
exorcist.
Right.
Um, so I've heard this before, and I've never heard it confirmed necessarily, but I've heard that Lucifer and Satan aren't necessarily the same person. Have you heard that before?
So I haven't heard. I've had people ask that question, and they're different names for the same entity, for the same being. Interestingly enough, I should say, Father Morse's first exorcism, he actually encountered Satan, or at least a demon that said his name was Satan. And it's doing more studies. It's not uncommon for demons. Their whole I'll back up a little bit. Their whole thing is they don't want to leave. So they're going to do whatever they can to stay. And they're going to lie. They're going to deceive. They're going to do all these different things. They're going to try to trick people to make them think that they are more powerful than they are, or to kind of just deceive them. So one of the first questions that exorcists ask in an exorcism, and it's permitted within the Roman ritual, because another thing you'll hear is you're not supposed to ask demons their names. Lay people were not supposed to, but exorcists are. And there's power within that. So if an exorcist can determine the name of a demon, then it helps them diagnose and better battle within that exorcism itself. So I bring that up because it's possible for demons to lie and say that they are Satan or Lucifer when they're not, to try to deceive, like, oh no, this is way more powerful than I can deal with, which I don't think any exorcist worth a salt would say. But it is a tactic for them to lie. But yeah, they are the same. They're the same.
Okay. How do exorcists discern whether or not the demon is lying to them? Because I thought that, or at least I've heard that when the exorcists command the demon for an answer of some sort, that they would not be allowed to lie.
Right. Yeah. So it's important to note that exorcist priests are not permitted, and it is highly, highly, highly dangerous for them to ask any questions out of curiosity. So they're limited to the questions that they can ask. Within those questions, there's basically two bulletproof ways to know whether or not a demon is telling the truth. One is, as you just mentioned, they can command in the name of Jesus to tell the truth, and they will have to tell the truth. The other way is, if exorcists, depending on how many cases that they've worked, they'll start to notice trends in behavior and statements. And so demons will, for instance, I can't remember the story exactly, but basically it boils down to this. The exorcist priest made a statement and the demon corrected them, right? Because demons are totally legalistic and they want to make a fool of everybody in the room and all these other sorts of things. And so there are times where demons will take the opportunity to correct the priest in order to try to embarrass him or make a fool of him. And after a certain amount of time, you hear enough of those statements from different demons that are all the same. And it either lines up with what we know to be theologically correct, or it's right within the realm of what we know to be theologically correct. So either like actually correct or adjacent. and then they can determine, okay, this is probably the reality of what's going on.
Okay. There are a team of people working on an exorcism. What does that look like? What does that team look like?
Right. So depending on the Exorcist, Father Bramante, who wrote for Pope Leo the 13th Institute, wrote that he had basically a center where he had a team that kind of helped ask questions outside of the exorcism while the person was lucid, to kind of determine, what life path this person was on, what are different things that they may or may not have engaged in, because that helps the exorcist determine where to go, where the demon may have made entry, those sorts of things. But the primary purpose of a team in a lot of ways is to have intercessory prayer for the person who's suffering, but prayers of protection for the priest. So a lot of these intercessory teams will just pray the rosary while they're in the midst of the exorcism. And the other big purpose is for accountability, because you don't want anyone making claims. You don't want anyone getting hurt. So when you have a group of people in the room, it keeps those things from happening.
So a priest wouldn't be alone.
Never. Oh, okay. Man. Yeah. If he wants the world to hurt, he's going to be alone. But other than that, I don't even know. I'd have to refer to the ritual or ask someone who knows more about this. But as far as I'm aware, I don't think they're actually permitted to be alone. I know for a fact they're not permitted to do exorcisms within like the bedroom of the person. So like the person's room, they can't do it there. It's almost always in a church or some offsite location.
Okay. And so from reading some of the reviews of the Pope's Exorcist, could you debunk some of the things that you heard about or that were wrong?
Sure. Yeah. So with them in the movie, one of the big things that just shocked me when I read it was that, and I guess it's probably a play off of the Exorcist movie, but in the Pope's Exorcist, the movie, and not the book, the movie.
Yeah, it's not in this book.
Yeah, they claim that Father Amorth offered himself to be possessed, which exorcists would never do. And that's why I think it kind of plays back to the Exorcist movie, because the priest in that movie did the same thing. That would never happen. It's happened once that I'm aware of, and it was in like the 1600s, and it was horrific. But no priest would ever do that.
What was the context of that?
So I think part of the problem was at this time, I believe it was a French priest who was, if I'm recalling the details correctly, I believe it was a French priest who was exorcising a group of nuns or a nun in a convent, and he just didn't know what he was doing, and he offered to be possessed instead of the woman. And of course the demon was like, hey, this is my I think the exorcist who was relaying the story said it's my Easter egg, right? So he got his prize. He got to possess a priest. Priest ended up trying to commit suicide at one point, and I don't remember how it ended, but it wasn't, the whole thing was just wrought with suffering and darkness. So that would never happen. Some more problems with the movie, I believe I read that it was wrapped around this like Da Vinci Code type story of, well, the Satan was behind the Crusades and the Vatican knew about it and they're trying to hide it and all these other different things. It's just nonsense. It's to whatever they can do to make a buck and make the church look bad. And yeah.
Yeah. And they say that it's based off of his the files that he wrote. Is that?
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, you look at what's funny to me is that he's been so open about all the things that he's done in all of his different books, and he's answered so many questions, and they can't even, if you look up and it may have changed by now, but if you look up the Pope's Exorcist movie, it says, well, Father Morth performed over 100,000 exorcisms. Like, he's written so many books where he says 60,000. He says, if I was to guess, it'd be around 60,000. Like, you guys can't even get basic. This is basic stuff. You can't even get that right. So yeah.
That's interesting. And his response to being like well known is kind of interesting. Like, he tried to show that he wasn't anything special.
Yeah, he called himself a good for nothing, which I love. He and what's fascinating is that he knew, as we all do in one way or another, suffer with pride, right? Which is like the root of all sin. And so he always reiterated, it's not me, I'm a good for nothing. And he knew very well, as I mentioned earlier, it's not the priest who does it. It's Jesus. It's Jesus it's God through the priest who's helping liberate people. And he's written and warned folks, if you think it's you, That's what the enemy wants. He's going to start poking at that pride, and next thing you know, you're going to go down this slippery slope, and it's going to end up in a bad place.
Yeah. Now, the book talks about Freemasonry.
Mm-hmm.
How does it connect with Satanism?
Yeah, so Freemasonry is a huge issue, huge issue. And there's a lot of different forms of Freemasonry, like the Elks Lodge is one of them. I mean, there's too many to list. And to kind of put in perspective how bad Freemasonry is for those, I've actually sat through at least one, if not multiple sessions where someone was going through the prayers renouncing Freemasonry. And the process of that is you have to say this particular prayer 3 times. Now, the prayer once takes 45 minutes to say. It's crazy. So you say it twice on your own, and then you say it a third time with a priest to ratify that you're rejecting these things, as well as confession, of course. And it's so intense that the people who are involved in Freemasonry at certain levels will promise, I believe it was 5 generations of their family. And so what we're seeing is you'll see people who maybe their grandparent or their grandfather was a Mason, and they are experiencing all sorts of horrific physical ailments, which I find very fascinating. And it's because of what in a way, it's kind of like generational sin, but it's because of what their ancestors, so to speak, were involved in with Freemasonry. But Freemasonry itself, some of the, if you read through the prayer, and you can find it online, and it kind of gives a whole list of different things. St. Michael Center has it out on their app and their website. But you can read how, at this level, this person rejects Jesus and says he was nothing more than XYZ. And they have to pretend, that they're like in a ritual death. I'm giving a little bit more flourish to it than maybe they have I've never experienced it within their own ranks. But it's all anti-Christian in all forms. And if anyone out there, if they have anyone whose family member was involved in Freemasonry, I would highly recommend that you, there's a short form, which is okay. But if you really want to make sure it's not going to bother you, start praying the long form, find a priest who will, who will ratify it for you, and just get that out of your life.
So even if you're a descendant of someone who was a Freemason, you can still be affected, and you should go through the same process that somebody who was a full Freemason would go through.
Yeah, with the exception of confession. So obviously,
Okay.
like for instance, this didn't happen in my family, but as an example, if my grandfather was a Mason, I wouldn't have to take that to confession because I didn't commit that sin. I would, however, have to go through those prayers and say it 3 times to help break that tie. And what you're essentially doing is, we understand that demons are incredibly legalistic. So when someone goes and becomes a Mason and they promise certain things, they're giving authority to the demons to impact their family, not just themselves, but their family in particular ways. So if you imagine that there's chains or talons, right? There's a chain around you and your family. And the only way to break that for someone who, as you said, is a descendant from someone who's chosen that path is to pray those prayers in order to break that authority structure that your grandparents or family members, whoever it was, kind of put in place.
What if is this the same? Would it be the same for if say you have a descent or an ancestor that did this, and and then if you went through the prayers, would your child then be in the same danger? Would they have to do the same thing, or would they be freed as well?
They would be freed as well. And it's all permitted by the grace of God, of course, but
Sure.
You're taking a stance and you're saying it stops with me. It stops here. So you don't have to worry necessarily about your generational line. So if something pops up, you keep it in the back of your mind. But every time I've experienced anything regarding Freemasonry, once that person decides it stops here, it stops there.
Okay. And there was a big, in the 1700s, 1800s, there was such I don't know when when maybe Freemasonry declined, or even if it has declined, but there were some of the most powerful people have been Freemasons in the world, and that's just dangerous because a lot of wealth and a lot of that type of thing and power follows down that generational line.
Yep.
So those people are all subject to those would they be considered curses, or what would they be considered? Just
Yeah, I don't know if it fits the strict definition, which I couldn't recount off the top of my head, but that's a good way to describe it so people kind of understand. And I mean, I live in the South, and man, you see Freemason symbols on license plates. It's still very active today, unfortunately. And now the other question people ask is, well, what can happen if my grandpa went to their lodge and he wasn't really he didn't rise up the ranks? You still got to be very careful, and I would still recommend praying those prayers. It's similar to well, I played with your Ouija board and I didn't get possessed. It's like, well, okay, fine. However, you're still playing with fire, and just because you didn't get a 3rd-degree burn doesn't mean that you didn't get some ash on you. You still got to make sure that you're clean and you're not dabbling in things that you're not supposed to dabble in.
Yeah. And with Freemasonry, hold on, sorry. Freemasonry, the organization kind of has this air of, I don't know, charity that they put upon themselves. How does that work? How do they put on this charitable, there are a lot of hospitals run by Freemasons?
Yeah, they're good salespeople, right? And that's the trick. They're again, demons deceive. That's their whole structure is deception. And so for them to be able to draw people in, they'll do whatever it takes, whether that's providing groceries and providing cookouts and things of that nature. If you can draw people in because it looks attractive, then they're going to draw people in. They're going to do what it takes to draw people in. And we know from scripture, the enemy can appear as an angel of light, so it's not outside the realm of possibility at all.
Yeah. Now, I have a personal beef with Freemasons. When I was born, what is it? I had congenital missing hands, missing arms, and all I have limb wise is my feet and my legs. And my parents took me to a Freemason run hospital, and they suggested that my parents have my feet cut off. Because I don't know. I mean, their rationale was that this would allow me to be able to walk maybe in the future. But it's incredibly short-sighted, obviously, of what the possibilities might hold in the future. But also, it just seems to me a bit suspicious.
Yeah, no, I mean, and even in hospitals that are not Freemason run, I have a lot of friends who are doctors, and they tell me some horrible stories about stuff that they have to deal with. But yeah, in that particular case, I have never heard about anything regarding feet, so I couldn't give you any insight into that. But man, that's not. Thank God your parents didn't listen. I'll say that.
Yeah. I'm very grateful for my parents for a lot of things. And when I was born, also, sorry, before I was born, they knew I was going to be born differently, and the doctors were like, "Well, it's too late for an abortion." I'm like, yeah, they were, they're like, yeah, that we weren't going to do that anyway.
Yeah, that wasn't an option for us.
No.
Thanks.
Anyways, so it's just, I have a strong dislike, even outside of all the church's warnings against Freemasonry. Even though they put on this air of charity and salesmen, they're good salesmen, they are certainly not to be trusted.
So I would guess maybe you have a strong connection to Maximilian Kolbe then?
What I don't know what is the connection there. I mean,
So
I do love Saint Maximin Kolbe, but
Saint Maximin Kolbe straight up said that the Freemasons are the enemy of the church. He had a strong dislike for the Freemasons. He was all about fighting them.
okay, yeah, I do love Saint Max Kolbe.
Yeah.
There is a shrine. The national shrine isn't too far away from where I live, so there's a connection there at
There you
least.
go. There you go.
But yeah, so is there anything? Well, actually, so my last kind of question, that one of the things that stood out in the book was his the differentiation between like fiction like Harry Potter
Mhm.
and fiction like Lord of the Rings. Like, and it seemed odd. I mean, the distinction seemed to be that the focus is on magic and wizardry in Harry Potter, and sort of Gandalf. I mean, there's a lot of deeper things regarding Lord of the Rings that makes, you know, things that it makes it Catholic, obviously, but that Gandalf isn't the center and isn't the protagonist of the story. Can you sort of expand a little bit about that?
Sure. Yeah. So he was asked a lot, especially when Harry Potter came out. Is this something that people should be engaged in? And he had a very nuanced comment that I appreciate, where he basically said essentially what you said, but he added a little bit more, which was, there's a risk involved where people are not differentiating between something that is a part of the story to drive the plot, like in Lord of the Rings, and something that is glorifying magic, which is condemned by the church, right? So that was his main issue with it. I'd be curious, though. I've always wondered this because, of course, Father Ripperger has spoken out very strongly against Harry Potter, Father Calloway, and the line. There's kind of two different camps there. Father Martin echoes more of what Father Amorth had said, and said basically, yeah, if you're kind of predisposed to falling into stuff, you probably shouldn't look at it. My whole thing is, I wonder if, knowing what we know now with things that like Father Ripperger has spoken about, if that would change his stance. Regardless, his stance is still true in the sense that, it is, if it's something that glorifies something negative or something that's condemned by the church, you probably need to not be engaged in it. But I don't know. Who knows? I do appreciate, though, that he was very nuanced with his comments on it, and he was very careful not to kind of. He felt like he was very in the middle, and I like that. I don't like. My whole thing is like, we have these two camps in the church, regardless of what it is, right? Everybody's in one of two camps. No one's in the middle, and so I love pulling people to the middle, and I feel like that's a lot of what he was doing.
So his position more so is caution
Right.
and not sort of intrinsically evil. Would that
Right.
okay?
That's a great way to say it.
And but what's interesting about like Lord of the Rings, I don't know if you know if you've ever read like the sort of the more like the Silmarillion.
I haven't read that one. I've heard it's good, but I haven't read it.
Okay, well, just like a part of that is that we kind of learned that Gandalf is basically an angel.
Right. Oh, interesting. Okay.
So all his abilities stem from a spiritual
Hmm.
power.
Interesting.
Uh, so in some sense, yes, the name wizard is on his character, but his power is of the angelic kind.
Right. Huh. That's really interesting. Yeah, because it made me reflect on stories. I don't know if you've ever read George MacDonald. He has a lot of prolific books. George MacDonald was actually a huge influence on C.S. Lewis and J.R.R. Tolkien. And two of his books that I absolutely love. I have one behind me that's from like 1912. It's really it was a great find. But The Princess and the Goblin, and then the follow-up, which is The Princess and Curdie. And it's interesting because there are aspects of this kind of like mystical thing that's going on, but very much like what J.R.R. Tolkien did, it was a part of the story. And I can't imagine reading those books to my daughter and my daughter going out and like trying to find whatever that magic thing was. You know what I mean?
Okay.
Whereas the risk now with Harry Potter is we have all these young people who are very easily influenced, who see magic glorified. And then, I went to Barnes and Noble last week, and they have an entire section on magic books, spell books, tarot cards, crystals, all these different things. And so you see, I can see exactly where Father Morth was going with this. Yeah, you need to be cautious, because if you're not being cautious and filtering things, you're going to end up being influenced and go down this path.
Do you think the decline of education has more to do with that too? Just like, not understanding sort of, I don't know, how the fiction element of it. If you're sort of inundated with this sort of Harry Potter stuff, if you have like a broader understanding of fiction and you have a lot of fictional, if you've read a lot of books, basically, you have a bigger understanding of fiction, would that make you less sort of influenced?
I think so. I think I've never thought about that before, but I think you've touched on something. I think there's something to that. Yeah, I think you're right. Normally, we're talking about these things, I kind of fall on the division of what the family is supposed to be. So you don't have parents explaining, because it all starts in the home.
Mm-hmm.
But that would even go to your point of education. Are the parents properly educating their kids? Are they showing them these classic books that they can read that are edifying? You can read C.S. Lewis, you can read J.R. Tolkien, you can read George MacDonald, you can read, Chesterton, all these classics. Flannery O'Connor is one of my all-time favorite authors, right? And then, yeah, I think you're right. I think if people had a better education, ideally from their parents, they could probably navigate those waters a little bit better.
And I do see, like, there's something obsessive about Harry Potter.
Yes.
People get incredibly obsessive. I do think that has something to do with the fact that they haven't read anything else. They haven't done anything else. That's all they know from their childhood. Now, I don't know if there is, maybe there is a spiritual element to that, but it just seems like our education is so bad that that's all they can cling on to. And that can be dangerous.
Well, I'll tell you, my biggest issue with these things is when you are touching on a particular aspect of something that the church has spoken out against. For instance, Enneagram is one that I've hammered endlessly hammered the Enneagram, and it's extraordinarily popular. And I presented people. What's that? The Enneagram?
I've never heard that. What is
Good.
That? Okay.
Yeah, it markets itself as a personality typing system, but when you go into the history of it, it's very clear that it's a cult. And I even found video from one of its creators who admitted to practicing essentially witchcraft in order to formulate the Enneagram. And you can show that to people, and their reaction is the same reaction that you get when you tell people, hey, maybe you should consider reading something other than Harry Potter. whether it's the Enneagram, whether it's Eastern yoga, whether it's, these sorts of things. The thing for me is they all have the same vitriolic reaction. And I'm like, oh, okay, there's something there. I don't know what that something is. It may just be unhealthy attachments, but that in and of itself should be enough for people to say, okay, I need to check myself. And if I am having this reaction to this thing, then I need to probably get rid of it.
Yeah. I've heard two different things about what I'm going to ask you in a second. What the Pentagram? Mm-hmm. I've heard that it has a Christian origin, or at least a Christian use. Is there anything to that, or is the Pentagram completely? Is that a sort of witchcraft thing?
So I'm not 100% touched up on the origins of the pentagram. I know that almost 100% of it in use today is used for demonic practices, or occult practices, whatever to say. Demonic and occult is essentially the same thing.
Is witchcraft the same thing as that too?
Yeah, basically.
Okay, yeah. They're all the same. Okay.
Yeah. It's all led by demons. No matter what form it is, it's all led by demons, right?
Okay.
Now, I will say, to be as intellectually honest as possible, there are a lot of instances where the occult has taken Christian imagery and used it for their own means. So I'm not ruling out, because again, I don't know for sure. I'm verbally processing here with you.
Mm-hmm.
I'm not ruling out that there may be a potential that it was a Christian image at some time. However, in modern use, it's very obvious. Like I would never have anything. If I see a pentagram, it's like, okay, there's a red flag. Something not good is going on here, or whatever.
If it was a Christian symbol originally, would its usage currently taint that, or like how would that work?
That's a good question. So I don't think it would necessarily taint it in the sense that if God created something good, then see, now you're tapping into my lack of theology here. I got to break out the Summa, right? So I struggle to say that it would taint it, for instance. However, yeah, I don't know. I don't know how to answer that question, because the thing that's coming to mind right now, I'll just tell you, is the triangle, right? So you see the triangle most often associated today, people would recognize it with Illuminati. But if you look at old, like really classic old Catholic, purely Catholic art, the triangle was used to almost always depicted around God himself, or you'd see an image of God, Jesus, the Holy Spirit, these sorts of things, and there'd be a triangle behind God's head, because it was a symbol of the Catholic faith in that way. And we've seen how the occult, and particularly in Illuminati circles, where they've tried to take that and make it their own thing. We have people pushing for so Halloween. I did a podcast episode on this, gosh, I think like 2 years ago, and the history and the origins of Halloween. All Hallows Eve, right?
Mm-hmm.
It was originally a Catholic holiday. Technically, it still is a Catholic holiday.
Yeah,
so regardless of if bad actors are trying to turn it into something else, it itself is still Christian. So in terms of the pentagram, you'd have to really determine where it came from to answer that question. And that unfortunately, I'll add it to my list of things to research, but that off the top of my head, I don't know that one.
Get on that one.
Yeah.
I'll need an answer.
Okay.
Well, it's been a pleasure talking to you, Jordan. Where can people find your work?
So most of my work is on Instagram at do_the_harder_thing. We're going to have a series come out called The Devil's in the Details. We're really excited about it. We're going to help people navigate these waters, really take hyper complex topics like spiritual authority and make it really understandable. We're interviewing a ton of experts. So that's all on Instagram and spiritualdirection.com's YouTube. Also spiritualdirection.com, Avalon Institute, My High Calling, all these different things. But yeah, it's all out there.
Okay, sounds good.
Awesome.
The link to get the Pope's Exorcist 101 questions about Father Gabriel Omoth will be linked in the description, so you can go out if you found this conversation really interesting and want to know more answers to the questions you might have about Father Amorth. Thank you, Jordan, for coming on. I'm really happy we got to have this discussion.
Yeah, thank you so much. It was a blast.
Well, everyone, please like, share, comment, and subscribe. People need to know about exorcisms and the power of the demonic and how to avoid that. Yep. So thank you all for watching, and have a blessed day. Bye.